The Viking Era is a period following the Germanic Iron Age, from around the year 793 to 1066. Norsemen used rivers and oceans to explore Europe for trading, raiding and conquest. Of course, history from so long ago is far from exact. Much of what we know about the era is based on Icelandic sagas, stories that were written hundreds of years after the events took place, if they ever took place at all. This is one of the biggest criticisms of Viking history. Which historical records there are tend to have been left by the people that the Norsemen conquered. So while those accounts will likely paint a one-sided picture, they do at least help us begin to pull a Viking timeline together. Bear in mind when reading these dates and facts that many historians disagree on details. In some cases the dates aren't clear, in others there's some doubt whether the events even happened at all. So let's first break down the Viking timeline before we head into the ending part to what happened to the Vikings and where they went. Starting off at 791, raids begin on the British Isles. Early targets were Christian monasteries on small islands which were often unprotected. One of the most famous early raids was in 793 at Lindisfarne, northeast England. It was described by Anglo-Saxon writers as heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter, according to English heritage. 830, the Osberg ship is buried, arguably the finest artifact to have survived the Viking Age. The Osberg ship discovered near Tunsberg was buried around this time. Skeletons of 2 women were found with the ship. The ship is today on display in Oslo, while a reconstruction bobs in the harbour of Tunsberg. 8040, Norse settlers found Dublin, or rather they seized the ecclesiastical settlement and began to build a camp on their own, which would go on to become the capital of the Republic of Ireland. Part 2, Far and Wide. In 8044, Muslims repel a Viking raid in Spain. Vikings sailed up the Guadalquivir River to raid Sevilla. A Muslim army fought back, and a rapid Muslim response dissuaded the Vikings from further attacks on Spain. 8066, Vikings established a kingdom in York. Danish Vikings take York in the north of England and establish a kingdom. The Northumbrian kings Eil and Osbert were not captured. However, you can learn more about York's perspective on the era's history at the Jorvik Viking Center. Part 3, Control and Establishment. 8072, Harald gains control of Norway. According to medieval Icelandic historians, Harald Fairhair became the first king of Norway and would rule to 930. He was regarded to have unified Norway after the Battle of Hafrsfjord. The famous sword sculpture of Stavanger commemorates this moment. 8078 to 8090, the Danelaw Pact. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum is signed, defining the political split of England between Alfred and the Danes. The Old English document survives in Cambridge's Corpus Christi College. Part 4, Southern Europe. In 900, raids along the Mediterranean. Vikings began a series of raids in the a few years later. The Swedish Olaf the Wise led a force to Constantinople, a city now known as Istanbul. He was well paid to turn around and leave. 911, Rollo founds Normandy in France. Viking chief Rollo is granted land by the Franks after he besieged Paris. The descendants of Rollo and his followers adopted the local languages and became the Normans. Part 5, Battles in Britain. 910, the Battle of Tettenhall, Wednesfield. Forces from Mercia and Wessex combined to defeat the Northumbrian Vikings. The battle saw the defeat of the last great Danish army to ravage England. 915 to 918, Battles of Corbridge. On the banks of the Tyne River, an army of Englishmen fighting under the Norse king Ragnald defeated the Scots. The second encounter is also known as the Battle of the Bloody Acres. Part 6, Even Farther, Even Wider. 941, Rus Vikings attack Constantinople. The Rus and their allies took advantage of the Byzantine fleet and army being thinly spread. The imperial capital essentially stood defenseless. The Rus were said to have violently killed their victims. It was one of many wars between the two sides. 981, Eric the Red discovers Greenland. Expelled from Norway and later Iceland, Eric the Red settled in Greenland with 25 ships, people and goods. Within around 20 years, more than 3,000 Vikings were said to be living on Greenland as farmers. 986. Viking ships sight Newfoundland. Lance O. Meadows National Historic Site is the only authenticated Norse site in North America. Leif Erikson is the man credited with discovering the region, but according to stories it was Bjarnu, Harrier of Sol, who first discovered the land, having been blown of course from a journey to Greenland. About 10-15 years later, Erikson would go on to lead an expedition to the New World. Part 7. The influence of Christianity. 995. Norway's Viking king builds a Christian church. The founder of Trondheim, Olaf Tryggvason, built the first Christian church in Norway. He had spent time on the Scilly Isles, where Ser is said to have foreseen a battle in which Tryggvason would suffer great wounds and then convert. Shortly after the meeting, he survived a vicious attack and dully converted. He returned to Norway to take the throne, and so began Norway's slow conversion. 1000. Christianity arrives in Iceland and Greenland. Although the faith had already begun to spread, it really took hold when Norway's king Olaf began to convert chieftains. He also imposed trade restrictions on those that refused. Part 8. The Last Days. 1015. The North American settlement is abandoned. The area known as Vinland was abandoned, most likely due to limited supplies and a long journey required to trade with Scandinavia. 1030. The Battle of Stiklestad. Norway's Christian king Olaf Haraldsson was defeated in the Battle of Stiklestad. Churches and shrines to Saint Olaf were built in his honor across Europe. Some historians doubt the authenticity of the battle, however, and say Olaf could have been killed by his own people. 1066. Battles in England. England's king Harold Godwinson defeated Norway's Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, while William Duke of Normandy defeated the Saxon king Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Part 9. The rise and fall of Viking king Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. Harald Hardrada ruled Norway from 1046 to 1066. Whichever way you spell his name, here's a story of the last great Viking ruler. 1066 was a major turning point in British history as Anglo-Saxon rule came to an end, to be replaced by the modern monarchy that persists to this day. For the Vikings in Norway, however, it was more than simply a turning point in history. King Harald Hardrada, said by many to be the last great Viking ruler of Norway, met his demise, and so the Viking Age was officially over. Like much of European history, these two seemingly unrelated facts are actually part of the same story. You can view the story from the eyes of the British, though Harold was merely a supporting character in the Norman takeover of Britain. Much better is to take a journey through the literal Byzantine journey made by Harold, from a half-brother of Saint Olaf to a Norwegian king in his own right, and also a pretender to the British throne. Part 1. That's not my name. Before we delve too deeply, let's sort out Harald's name. The name Hardrada is actually a nickname meaning something along the lines of hard ruler. The modern Norwegian form would be Hardrada, or in the Old Norse, Harorai. One scholar, Judith Jess from the University of Nottingham, argues that Hardrada is a bastard Anglicization of the original epithet, in an oblique case, but still it endures. Further studies suggest it might not be the best nickname to use anyway. Other sources give versions of Harfagri, beautiful hair, as being Harold's nickname. It's possible that the nickname has fallen out of favor to avoid confusion with an earlier king known as Harald Fairhair. Perhaps Fairhair was the name Harald wished to be known by, and it was his enemies who gave him the name Hardrada. Either way, neither of those is the real name. Harald was the son of Sigurd Syr, and so his real name would have been Harald Sigurdsson. But as Harald is mostly known by his nickname, I'll stick to that throughout to avoid confusion. Also, along the way, we'll be meeting Harold Godwinson, an important but short-lived English king. Hopefully things won't become too confusing. Remember, Harold, Norwegian, Harold, English. Easy. Part 2. The early life of Harald. Harald was born in around 1015 to Asta Gudbrandsdatter and her second husband Sigurd Syr. His half-brother Olaf, later to become Saint Olaf, had just declared himself king of Norway and was setting about making that reality. The youngest of three brothers, Harald, was the only one who displayed ambitions beyond the family farm. Harald and Olaf's father are both said to be descended from Harald Fairhair, the legendary first king of Norway. Many scholars believe that Olaf may have been related to Harald's Fairhair and Harald Hardrada probably wasn't, but that's a family matter. Harald Fairhair united all of the fiefdoms in Norway. throughout alliances and military strength into a country under a single rule. Growing up, Harald admired his half-brother Olaf, who in a few short years had managed to control more of Norway than anyone since Harald Fairhair. Both Olaf and Harald felt that uniting all of the Norway was their calling. So, Harald was most distressed when in 1028 Olaf was deposed by Knut the Great of Denmark and driven into exile in Kievan Rus. In 1030, at the tender age of 15, Harald received the news that Olaf was on his way back. He gathered 600 men from around the uplands and they traveled to meet Olaf on their arrival across the border from Sweden. Together, they gathered an army and set about trying to regain the Norwegian throne. Part 3. The Battle of Stiklestad. According to the sagas of Sturluson, Olaf had amassed an army by the time he crossed the mountains from Sweden and arrived in the valley of Hardrada, about 50 miles north of the capital, Nidaros, now Trondheim. Modern scholars doubt this and suggest that he may have gathered a ragtag bunch of robbers, bandits and miscreants, but nothing like a large or useful army. Either way, when they arrived at Stiklestad farm in the lower end of the Verdal Valley, they were met by an army of some 14,000 men led by Harald of Tjocha, Thorir, Hund and Kalfr Arnason, the latter being one of Olaf's ex-military leaders. The battle did not go well for the half-brothers Olaf and Harald. Olaf was killed, possibly by a spear of Thorir Hund, and Harald was severely wounded. Olaf's body was secretly taken away to be buried and Harald managed to escape. The one saving grace was that, according to sources, Harald acquitted himself very well in the battle, showing considerable talent. Escaping to eastern Norway with help from Rognalf Brusa's son, Harald stayed at a remote farm to allow his wounds to heal. A month later, he secretly traveled over the mountains to Sweden and, about a year after the battle, finally arrived in the relative safety of Kievan Rus. Part 4. The Exile to Kievan Rus. Kievan Rus, sometimes known as Rutenia, was effectively what we might consider to be the northwest corner of the Soviet Union. Today, its lands are shared between Belarus, Ukraine, Poland and Russia. The original Rus people are thought to have been Norse travelers, spreading out through the Baltic Sea. Details of Harald's time in exile are quite sparse. It's likely he spent at least some of his time in the town of Staraya Ladoga, that is now part of the Leningrad Oblast. This was a popular trading outpost at the time and some consider it the first capital of Russia. Harald and his men were greeted warmly by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise and his wife Ingegard. Ingegard was a Swedish princess and distant cousin of Harald's. They had hosted Olaf during his time in exile there, and happily extended their hospitality to his increasingly notable half-brother. Yaroslav was in great need of military leaders and so, recognizing his relationship to Olaf and his similar qualities, made him a captain of his forces. It's likely that Harald took part in the campaigns against many people including the Poles, Jutes, Byzantines and Pechenegs. After a couple of years helping Yaroslav in Kievan Rus, Harald and his men set out to travel further south. Part 5. Making money in Miklagard. In around 1033 and 1034, Harald and his men arrived in Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire as it became known. The Norsemen knew it was Miklagard from Mikil meaning big and Garor meaning wall, overall something like stronghold. They joined up with the elite Varangian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard that was made up of men from Northern Europe, Scandinavia and Britain. This ensured that the guards were not tainted by local politics and rivalries and could be relied upon to deal with any threats of uprising effectively. Though some people claim that Harald was traveling incognito, most believe this would have been impossible. News of military strength traveled faster than almost any other news during this time, and so Harald's exploits in Norway and Kievan Rus would have been too well known for him to hide. Harald and his men soon found themselves fighting all over, from the Mediterranean to the Tigris and Euphrates and all the way down to Jerusalem. Harald was very popular with the emperor, Michael IV, and soon found himself the leader of the Varangian Guard. Despite a small defeat in Sicily, Harald was called back to Constantinople and rewarded with the titles from the emperor. Unfortunately for Harald, Michael IV died and was succeeded by his nephew Michael V, who didn't trust Harald at all. Harald was imprisoned, somehow managed to escape and took a ship back up to the north. Part 6. Back to Rus. Harald's first stop was Kievan Rus, where he once again met with Yaroslav the Wise. Harald had become very rich, thanks to being well rewarded for his services and also from plundering on his travels. Sources tell of 3 times when he took part in Politasvach, which translates as palace plunder. It would either have been literal plunder after the emperor died, or a huge payment from the new emperor to ensure good relations. In Rus, he married Yaroslav's daughter Elizabeth. Harald supposedly asked to marry her on his first visit when she would have been around 14, only to be rejected because he was not wealthy enough. Returning triumphantly with great riches, he joined prominent royals such as Henry I of France, Andrew I of Hungary, as a partner of one of Yaroslav's children. Not long after Harald arrived in Kievan Rus, Yaroslav attacked Constantinople by sea. It's likely that Harald provided information about the military there. They offered the chance to pay money or fight in the Byzantines chose to fight. The Rus easily beat the Byzantine fleet, but was then heavily damaged in a storm to return to Kievan Rus with nothing to show for their troubles. Eventually, Harald headed westward from Novgorod back to Staraya Ladoga, where he purchased a ship. He sailed the rivers into the Baltic Sea and arrived back in Sweden around the end of 1045. In his absence, the throne of Norway had been taken by one of his nephews, Magnus the Good, who had also managed to claim the Danish thrones as well by defeating Sweyn, Astrid's son, the main pretender. Harald met up with Sweyn in Sweden, as well as the Swedish king. Arna, Jacob and 3 men set out to defeat Magnus together. Part 7. Claiming the throne. Their first act was to attack the Danish coast, in an effort to show that Magnus was either unable or unwilling to protect them. This was successful, but Magnus, who was abroad at the time, heard of the attack and correctly assumed that the next target was Norway. It's likely Harald's main plan was to claim the throne of his father's previous petty kingdom and then claim the rest either by diplomacy or force. Instead, Magnus returned home, on the word of his advisors, sought to build an alliance rather than engage in war. Each had something the other wanted, so it wasn't too difficult to come to an arrangement. Harald had vast wealth from his exploits abroad, while Magnus was effectively bankrupt. So they agreed that Harald would be co-ruler of Norway, but not Denmark, while Magnus would hold the final say. In return, Harald would share half of his wealth with Magnus. It's said that during their co-rule, the 2 men kept very much to themselves, and their only known meetings almost ended in violence. Fortunately for Harald, after less than a year, Magnus died. Depending on who you believe, he either fell overboard, fell off a horse, or fell ill and died of disease. In a statement on his deathbed, Magnus made Harald his heir in Denmark and Sweyn his heir in Denmark. Thus, after 18 long years since Olaf was deposed, Harald ascended to his rightful place as the King of Norway. During his reign, he spent a lot of time and effort trying to gain control of Denmark from Sweyn until they eventually made peace in 1064. Part 8. 1066 and all that. And so we come full circle to 1066, which, if you're British, is approximately when history, at least what you get taught in school, begins. There were 4 pretenders to the throne when Edward the Confessor died. Harold, Godwin's son, who was Edward's brother-in-law, William of Normandy, who was Edward's cousin, Edgar Atheling, who was an Anglo-Saxon prince and Edward's great-nephew, and Harald Hardrada, who believed he was owed the throne through an agreement with Harald Knut, a previous Viking king of England. Harold's brother, Tostig, hated Harald and encouraged Harald Hardrada to come and claim the throne. Harald got a crew together and raided from the north of England. They initially succeeded at the Battle of Gate Fulford, when he defeated the Earls Edwin and Morcar. The men continued on, with only light armor, as they were expecting no more than easily crushed resistance they'd received so far. Unbeknown to them, Harold Godwin's son and his army were already in the area and were preparing to repel the invading forces. The 2 armies met at Stamford Bridge and clashed violently. Harald met his demise early in the battle as an arrow struck his throat. The rest of the men fought on but were ultimately defeated. They fled and returned to Norway. Harold, meanwhile, didn't have much time to revel in his victory as, shortly after, William attacked from Normandy. His men killed Harold at the Battle of Hastings and he became William I of England. And that was that for the Vikings. The True Blood Vikings were all done and the raiding stopped, but we don't stop for sure. So if you want to know what drugs were like for Vikings, click the video you see on screen now, but don't forget to like and subscribe before you go. See you in the next one.